Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Jill Zippin. I am chairwoman of Democratic Jewish Outreach Pennsylvania. Democratic Jewish Outreach Pennsylvania is a proud member of the Jewish Battleground Coalition. The Jewish Battleground Coalition is made up of Jewish Democrats in key battleground states that worked during the campaign to elect Joe Biden as president and their candidates in their respective states. We found that we were, like Hillary Clinton said, better together. The states that are part of the Battleground Coalition include Texas, Florida, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So thank you for all being here tonight. We are very lucky to have with us tonight two fabulous speakers, Dr. Ira Sheskin and Jeff Pollack. Before we begin, I just want to take note that today is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which commemorates the 76th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. President Joe Biden issued an excellent statement, but I thought it worthwhile to read the last paragraph of his statement because he says it better than I could. When hatred goes unchecked, and when the checks and balances in government and society that protect fundamental freedoms are lost, violence and mass atrocities can result. The United States will continue to champion justice for Holocaust survivors and their heirs. We are committed to helping build a world in which the lessons of the Holocaust are taught and in which all human lives are valued. And tonight as well is the Erev Tu B'Shavat, and it is significant that on this date, Joe Biden put forth much of his environmental policy. If you heard him speak this afternoon, he spoke to that. I will begin with an introduction of Jeff Pollack, and then Sam Edelman will introduce Dr. Sheskin, and then they will both speak. Jeff will go first, and then we'll do some Q&A. So definitely put your questions that you may have in the chat box. So now I'm going to introduce Jeffrey. Jeffrey is the founding partner and president of Global Strategy Group. He has helped build it into the premier strategic and research communication firm. He was twice awarded Pollster of the Year in 2015 and 2011. He is regularly sought after by Democratic presidential candidates, governors, members of Congress, and leading advocacy organizations and Fortune 100 companies, everyone from Everytown for Gun Safety to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and New York Magazine. He has served as an instructor of public policy and administration at Columbia's University School of International and Public Affairs. He has guest lectured at the Military Academy, Harvard University, Georgetown, George Washington, and University of Pennsylvania. He holds a master's degree in public policy and administration from Columbia. He graduated cum laude from University of Pennsylvania, and he's on the national board of the American Association of Political Consultants. As an aside, he's also a member of the Screen Actors Guild. Sam, why don't you introduce Ira? Sam?
Okay, I am Sam Edelman, Professor Sam Edelman. I'm a colleague of Ira's at University of Miami, and I'm on the State of Florida Democratic Jewish Caucus, and I'm proud to introduce Professor Ira Sheskin. Ira is one of the most widely recognized experts in the area of geography and demography and the Jewish community. He is a stellar writer. His areas of expertise include the collection, analysis, and presentation of quantifiable data. He is the editor of the American Jewish Yearbook, which is one of the preeminent research books about the Jewish population in the United States. He is the author of numerous books and articles on the Jewish community. He's called upon by many communities to do demographic research. He has done work on 55 American Jewish communities and has authored over 50 studies of the Jewish communities across the United States. So I'm very proud to be a friend and a colleague of Professor Ira Sheshkin, and he will be speaking after Jeff.
Why don't you take it away, Jeff?
Okay, thank you, Jill. I appreciate the invitation to come back here from you, Jill. And of course, I'm happy to be here representing my mother, Joy Pollack, and her partner, Bert Siegel. I am always happy to go through stuff. While, of course, I am a nice Jewish boy, I am, of course, a failure for having not been a lawyer and a doctor. So I will just get through this presentation and hope that my mother can suffer the embarrassment of what I've become, because as a pollster, it's not exactly something to be proud of these days. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a bit. But let's first start with what exactly happened in the election. And like the reality is that this is an election that has really been a story of two waves. If you look at these two sides, there are really two stories, which is sort of why the election in some ways keeps going on. Biden won the most votes ever. He won 81 million votes, but Trump won the second most votes ever at 74 million. And so just a massive turnout, which we're going to talk about in just a bit. Biden redrew the map in that he won by more than 4 points nationwide and won in states that we never expected. But let's be clear, Biden came dangerously close to falling short of 270, which I'll show you. Biden surged in the suburbs and the exurbs. Trump did very well and held on to the rurals, but he actually cut into some of the margins for Joe Biden in the cities. Biden won on the pandemic, but Trump actually won on the economy. People who cared about the economy won for Trump. People who cared about the pandemic voted for Biden. The Democrats, of course, held on to the House in the slimmest of margins. But the reality is, when you look at the seats and look at how we won, it was incredibly difficult to win and hold on. And the holding of the House, actually, the Democrats have not gotten nearly enough credit for. But that translates into the Republicans holding the Democrats to the slimmest majority we've had in the post-war era. And then finally, we win control of the Senate. We defeat 4 incumbents. But the Republicans won in every single state where Trump won, and won 1 state where Biden won in Maine, which we'll talk about. So we end up with a 306 to 232 electoral vote margin. Donald Trump himself called that a massive win, so clearly a massive win. But I want you to look at just how close we came to losing. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Nebraska 2, that gets us to 269 on the electoral map. Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona, if you look at the numbers there, we're talking about 44,000 votes. If they had flipped the other way, Biden loses and Donald Trump is president of the United States. And many of us find that hard to believe. But that is how difficult the Electoral College is for us these days when you look at it. It is really, really incredibly hard. And thank God for Georgia, which we'll get to, of course, on the Senate. So let's talk about sort of the change that happened and what happened. This data shows you the margin of victory, or the change in margin, I should say, between 2020 and 2016. So where was the biggest change in margin? Let's start up at the top, the exurbs. Biden lost by 10 in 2020, but Hillary lost by 17, close to 18. And so when you look at the change in margin, it's a 6.6% change in that electoral margin. So even though Biden lost it by 10 points, the shift was massive. Where was the other massive shift? I'm going to skip the second one for a second and come back to it. College towns, urban suburbs, graying America, and middle suburbs. So what's the story? The suburbs and the exurbs are the stories, which I'll show you in just a bit. There's that one exception, though, that I skip, which is military posts. What does that mean? Fascinating. In places, in counties where there is a military fort, where there's a base of some sort, the numbers actually got better. Trump won them only by 11% this time, whereas he won them by 16%, 17% last time. And so there was actually considerable effort done by some groups nationally to try to win over military voters, and you can see some of that. Now flip to the bottom. Where did we lose voters? Well, we lost voters in Hispanic centers. Biden lost Hispanic centers by 2 points in 2020. Clinton won Hispanic centers by 2 points in 2016. The loss in the Hispanic vote, or the decline in the Hispanic vote, was very real. And it's hard because as Democrats, the reality, there are sort of two realities. Joe Biden is president of the United States because of Black and brown people. There's no question that that is true. But it is also true that we did worse in big cities, which you see here, and in Hispanic centers. So even though that we won because of on the backs of Black and brown voters, we actually need to be very clear that we declined from 2020 to 2016 and need to be careful about that. Let's talk about Georgia that I mentioned. Okay, so this is the biggest change when you look at sort of what happened in states. This is only the presidential, forget about the Senate. This is just the presidential. So what happened? Trump wins by 5 points in 2016. Biden wins by the teeniest margin in 2020. When you look at it, it's all about the Atlanta suburbs. It's all about all the city suburbs, Savannah and Columbus and Augusta. But the Atlanta suburbs are obviously the majority of the story here. So where did the vote become more Democratic? 7 points more Democratic among high income, college grads, suburban. Well, those are all overlapping things. Seniors, that's actually huge, got better by 5 points. Obama-Trump areas, places that were voted for Obama, then Trump, actually rebounded and went back to Biden by 5 points. In the rural areas in Georgia, we actually picked up a point. White, non-college educated, a point. Majority Black, a point. But urban areas barely moved. And in places that were majority, more than 80% Black, 0.5% points the other direction, and the same with Hispanic. So again, the data is clear. Black and brown communities, by and large, where places were heavily Black and brown, we actually lost ground. So what about the House? So I mentioned how difficult the gerrymandered House was. Look down at the bottom. The bottom is where all the change happened. What you can see is all those little red dots down at the bottom are districts where Trump actually won those districts. He won them by 10 points, many of them. Utah 4, South Carolina 1, Michigan 3, New Mexico 2. So yes, the Republicans did well in the House, but the reality is, by and large, they did well in places they should have done well. There's only a couple of seats that they won that they shouldn't have. California 39, California 21, and the 2 South Florida seats that we know went the wrong way with how Florida went. At the same time, we picked up 3 seats. We picked up 2 in North Carolina, but we picked those up because of redistricting, not because of anything real. But we did pick up Georgia 7, which was part of those Georgia suburbs that did well for us. So why did we do so poorly in the House? Let me explain. People don't understand what happened from a turnout perspective and how massive it was. Let's pay attention to South Carolina 1. This is a district in 2016. It was a Republican district. The Republican won by a huge margin, 190,000 to 120,000 votes. So you can see in 2016, there were about 310,000 votes in South Carolina 1. In 2018, Joe Cunningham wins by the teeniest margin, 4,000 votes. A Democrat wins. This is the Charleston and the Charleston suburbs. Joe Cunningham wins by a teeny margin, 4,000 votes. Total number of votes cast, 290,000 votes, actually very close to 2016. In 2020, 425,000 people, more than 425,000 people voted in this congressional district. That is an increase of 125,000 votes from 2016, a massive increase. And Joe Cunningham got 210,000 votes. If I had told Joe Cunningham, he wasn't my client, but if I had told him a week before the election he was going to get 210,000 votes, I'm telling you, he would have said he was going to crush. So Democratic turnout was very high, but Republican turnout was even higher. And you see the exact same pattern in Iowa 1, in Virginia 7, where we barely eked it out, but still huge turnout, and in California 48 in Orange County. So Democrats added votes from 2018, but Republicans did even better on the back of Donald Trump. On the Senate, thank God we get 50-50. Chuck Schumer is the majority leader, all on the heels of Georgia. But we're disappointed because, of course, we won every seat that we were defending except for Alabama, which is what we expected. But we certainly expected to pick up in other places, particularly Maine, a state that I was involved in, North Carolina, where, of course, scandal probably did us in, Iowa, Montana, so many races that we were invested in, the millions upon millions of dollars that were invested in South Carolina and Kentucky that were all for naught. But what happened in the Senate races? Well, big picture, the presidential and the Senate race were very close to each other. On average, Democrats lost in the Senate battleground states by about 7 points. Trump beat Biden by about 7 points in all these places. Were there places where the Democrats did a little better than Biden? Sure, but not much. Were there places where Biden did a little better than the Democrats? Sure, not much. The reality is there was very little split ticket voting that happened. And we see that in the congressional districts. Today, there are 16 split congressional districts, meaning they voted Democrat for president, Republican House, or they voted Republican president, Democratic House. 16 districts. That is the smallest in modern history. Go back to even 1996, you're talking about 110 seats that were split. We're down to 16. So split ticketing didn't happen. Why is that? Well, mainly because voters in a number of places, particularly in the suburbs, voted for Biden, but then they voted for a Republican for the House. Why is that? They voted for Biden because of the pandemic, but they were voting for House members in the inverse way. They cared about the economy and they thought that the Republicans were better on the economy. These voters are closer to the Democrats on things like the pandemic and science and climate change, but on business, on taxes, on Black Lives Matter, on the police, on race issues, these voters are much closer to the Republicans. And therefore, they voted for Biden at the top and said, we're done with Trump's nonsense, but we are not ready to give the Democrats the store. So what about the polls? So of course, we all know the polls were wrong again. And the error was even greater in some places. And so there was an overestimation of the Democratic margin in all of the public polls consistently across the board. But in private polls, the private polls were actually better. In the presidential battlegrounds, for example, the private polls were off by less than 1.5 points, where the public polls were off by 2. And in the Senate battleground states, the private polls were off by about 2, and the public were off by about 3. That still sucks. It's still not a very good thing, and the pollsters need to explain why. So what we know is that the Republicans have no secret sauce. On the left side of this slide, you see Trafalgar, which is a Republican polling firm. They predicted Trump would win 322 to 216. So don't think the Republicans have any secret sauce. Their numbers were just as bad as our numbers. So why? Is it the shy Trump thing? There is no shy Trump voter. You people know Trump voters are very shy. There's no such thing. And why would people be shy to tell us that they were voting for Joni Ernst in Iowa or Steve Daines in Montana, and certainly for Susan Collins in Maine? There's no evidence for a shy Trump voter. In 2016, we fixed the problems with non-college voters, for sure. That is certainly something that happened. But what happened in 2020? Well, I've got an explanation for that, or at least we think. And in 2016, one of the things that we thought was a problem was we were relying only on telephone interviews and that we need to look at different modes. And in 2017, 18, and 19, we did. Well, guess what? All of the modes were equally wrong in 2020. If you did internet polling, you were wrong. If you did robopolls, you were wrong. So it didn't matter. So what do we think really happened? There's really 3 things that we believe happened. Number 1, turnout error. We did not know who was going to turn out, and polling is a terrible tool to figure out who's going to turn out. We certainly didn't know who was going to turn out in the middle of a pandemic. The notion that voters would come out to vote, if you're a swing voter in Wisconsin, if you're going to come out on election day and vote in the middle of the pandemic and stand in line with a bunch of random people who could give you COVID, I didn't know that people would vote, but they did. And the people who came out to vote, we know on election day in particular, huge, massive turnout, and it was very Republican, including infrequent voters. So what else did we miss? Well, we were very excited during COVID because people were picking up the phones. People were paying attention to polls. People were actually taking our polls online. People were participating in research. But maybe we should have asked the question, who are the people who are staying home? Because the people who are out there saying, I'm not going to wear a mask, and I don't believe in science, and who believe in QAnon, well, those are probably not the same white non-college people for the white non-college voters who we adjusted for in 2016, I think there was a huge schism with those white non-college people, and therefore the white non-college folks we were talking to were not representative of the others. And then the final is late movement. There actually is a lot of data that shows that in the last tranche of the election, the last week, including in the exit polls, which are grossly wrong, but even if you take them with a grain of salt, showed that late movement went against the Democrats and towards the Republicans. And we saw that again this year. With that, I'm going to pause and turn it over to Dr. Sheskin, and then I'll take those questions in the chat when we come back in a bit. Dr. Sheskin, you're still muted.
Yeah, Ira, you have to unmute. You're muted. Ira, you have to unmute yourself.
Just did.
Okay.
Okay, good evening. I'm glad to be back with this group. I just eliminated a couple of slides because Jeff covered them quite well, and so consequently I won't touch a couple of topics I was planning on touching. Okay, so I'm at the University of Miami. Sam is my colleague. I'm glad to be here tonight. There are really three parts to this presentation. First, I want to talk a little bit about how surveys are done and a little bit about how sample size impacts particularly trying to predict results for Jews. We'll then look a little at Jewish voting patterns, and then I have some other thoughts about the questions that were sent to me that we wanted to talk about tonight. So let's first talk about survey modes for political polling and then sample size. There basically are kind of 7 different ways to do surveys out there, and you can see them here. I think it's fair to say that most political polling is done either by telephone or by intercept or exit polls. Home interviews, although there are a few large surveys out there that are still using them, are too expensive and too slow to do for political polls, right, about who you're going to vote for. It just takes too long to do it. No one is really doing these anymore. Mail surveys, very inexpensive, but again, it takes too long. And the problem with the mail survey is that those who feel strongly one way or another on a topic are going to answer, and those who are moderates are not going to answer a mail survey. That's been shown in a number of surveys. A procedure is coming up now and seeing increasing use, but I don't believe it's seen much use yet for political polling, called address-based sampling. Basically, you get the list of all American households from the post office. You select a random sample of addresses, send a letter asking them to go to the internet, call an 800 number, or ask for a mail survey. Where ABS surveys can be useful in the future is in doing congressional district polling. Why? Look at that, and I know this is from 2004, but it doesn't matter for making my point. Look at the 22nd congressional district in Florida at the shape of it. You can hit people and only hit people inside of that by using address-based sampling. Telephoning, most of the people you call wouldn't live in the 22nd district, nor if you asked them on the phone, do you live in the 22nd district, would they know the answer. So ABS surveys may prove useful for congressional district types of surveys, not for just before the election, but for looking at what issues people are interested in really between elections. Telephone surveys can be done in as little as one evening. The procedure that's best to use is something called random digit dialing. So you take the area code, 305, you take an exchange code, computer prints 4 random numbers at the end, you dial those numbers, and you ask questions of whoever happens to answer. This has been, for years, the kind of gold standard in many ways for political polling. What's happened, of course, to random digit dialing as you can see from this, right, 92% of those polls were angry over being bothered at mealtime. People have stopped answering their phones. And that, I think, affects surveys and political polling in a major way. The other thing that you can do, of course, are intercept surveys or exit polls when we're looking at things that are political. One problem that we have here is that in practice, the interviewer selects the respondents. So they're supposed to interview somebody coming out of the polling place and then look up, and whoever they see next, they're supposed to interview. The problem is that it's been shown that if you have a male interviewer, the next person they just happen to see is a relatively relatively good-looking young lady, and you do get some bias because they don't follow the rules. Now, the problem, of course, with intercept polls for finding out about how Jews voted is that Jews are only 2% of the population. So to find enough Jews, one has to oversample polling places in largely Jewish areas. So as an example, in Aventura, Florida, right, the Jews who live here, and this place has to be at least 70% Jewish, are different than the average Jew in America. They're more likely to be former Soviet Union, Hispanic, Israeli, and these groups vote differently from other groups. The other thing that's happened with exit polls, of course, is this has been complicated by early voting and by mail voting. Then we have an opt-in internet survey. That is where you send out a link and ask people to go to that link and fill out the survey. The problem is you just can't really get a random sample out of that. Whoever you can send the email out, you're probably sending it out to a list that you have. You could put it on, in which case the list is going to be biased. You can put the link on a public website, but the people who click on it and fill it out are not going to be a random sample of the entire population. In addition, internet surveys are going to not get the right share of people age 65 and over because, and this is 2019, 27% of those 65 and over are offline. For less than high school, you'll also underestimate them. For making under $30,000 a year. And also, you're not going to get your share of rural voters. So there are biases in any type of internet survey. Now, in the 2020 election, and I don't know if, Jeff, if I think you did go into this, but I think it's worth repeating here. The best explanation that I can find so far is that Republicans who support Trump were less likely to participate in the polls. Okay, and Jeff's point about the COVID-19 people staying home and being there to answer the phone is a particularly interesting one that I haven't seen in other places. The next thing that I want to spend a moment or two on is sample size. It is important. Now, we're going to look at the margin of error for surveys that split 50% Democrat, 50% Republican. Now, why do it for that split? Well, because that's where most elections happen, between 50-50 and 60-40. And this curve for 60-40 is not very different than the curve from 50-50. So here's what can happen here. If you interview 400 people at random, you get about plus or minus 5%. If you interview 1,200 at random, you get about plus or minus 2.8%. So often, 400 is kind of considered the minimum because you see if you go down to 200, you get a much higher level. And 1,200 at least is where most surveys want to end up. You'll notice that the curve only goes down slightly as you go all the way up here to 3,000. Very expensive for not much of a decrease in the margin of error. Now, I also want you to notice that up till this point, I haven't said anything about what percentage of Americans are being interviewed. It doesn't matter. Statistical theory says it really doesn't matter unless unless there's only 10,000 Americans, right? Which there aren't. We had 155 million vote. And many of the surveys did 1,200 surveys. Notice in 1,200 interviews, notice what a tiny percentage that is. And it doesn't make any difference. Now, here's the critical thing for Jews. Overall, if you do 1,200 surveys, you get a margin of error plus or minus 2.8%. Now, let's say that John King or Wolf Blitzer gives you the results for females. Well, in 1,200 surveys, there's going to be 600 females, give and take a few. That puts the margin of error at females at plus or minus 4%, also not so bad. But for blacks, who are 13% of the population, that will give you 150 blacks. That's plus or minus 8%. And because 2% are Jewish, you're only going to have about 25 Jews out of 1,200 surveys. Those results are actually plus or minus 20%. So one of the ways of dealing with that, of course, is to overcall Jewish areas. So overcall Brooklyn, you're going to run into Orthodox. Okay, that's part of the problem right there. How can you solve that? In addition to oversampling areas with high percentage, you can use an omnibus survey, as is done by SSRS, CNN's pollster. So they do 1,000 to 2,000 interviews a week. So let's say that they get fined 40 Jews each week, and over 10 weeks, they have a sample size of 400, which is good for about plus or minus 5%. So people do that with the National Opinion Research, General Social Survey, etc., to get a large enough Jewish sample. Next, with significant thanks to Dr. Ken Wald, who I saw is on the call tonight at the University of Florida, I was about to make this next few slides, and he sent them to me because he's working on something that's similar. Ken and I are co-authors with one another on an article. And so most of all the slides with the blue background came from him. I might have done a few little modifications here and there for tonight, but I thank you again, Ken, for this. Notice the first point that should be made is that if you go back to 72 to 88, the percentage of Jews voting for Republicans, much higher than it is from 92 to 2008. And when we look at the next slide, it's at 27% for 2018-19 and 2020. Here's the vote for Republicans back to 1994. It really hasn't changed all that much. Now, for the 2020 election, we've had 4 polls come out with results on the Jewish population. One done by the Republican Jewish Coalition, another done by Associated Press through the National Opinion Research Center, one done for the American Jewish Committee by SSRS, and one done for J Street. First of all, I'm nervous about polls that are done for an advocacy organization. And I hear you, Jeff, that the private polls, which I believe are done for advocacy organizations, came closer. I hear you, and I'm sure you're right on it. Yet, I don't know, I have unease when I'm looking at a poll done by people who have a particular agenda. The two in the middle don't have an agenda. I look at them as more neutral in general. Now, the problem, though, with both the AP and the RJC poll is right here. It's how do you screen for Jews? Okay? The Republican Jewish Coalition had one question. In order to ensure that we speak with people of various backgrounds, can you tell me what is your religion or religious heritage? According to the Pew 2013 survey, which was done quite right, okay, you're going to probably miss 25% of Jews if that's the only question used to identify Jews. Because about 25% of Jews, when asked, what is your religion, answer atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular, I don't know, etc. The Associated Press just asked, what is your present religion, if any? Okay, they also missed 25%. Now, the American Jewish Committee poll, what is your present religion, if any? And then if they give any of those answers, nothing in particular, don't know, atheist, agnostic, do you consider yourself to be Jewish for any reason? And an answer of Jewish to 1 or a yes to 2 puts you in as a Jew and identifies hopefully 100% of people who consider themselves Jewish. The J Street poll, as you can see, used a similar set of questions to AJC. Okay. The point is these two polls miss Jews of no religion. That's at least 25% of American Jews. Jews of no religion tend to be younger, less likely to be affiliated, less likely to be Orthodox or conservative, and more likely to be Democrats. So these two polls are missing people who are more likely to be Democrats, and that's why they show such a higher percentage voting for Trump than these two polls do. They're simply missing Jews of no religion because of the way in which they screened their sample. Should Jews of no religion be concluded? Of course. We have on here right now 162 people, and I bet you there are at least some who would identify themselves that way. Here's a Republican activist, you can skim it on your own, who clearly has no idea of the nature of Jewish identity in America today. A few other things, again, thanks to Ken Wald. Here is the percentage Republican among various religious groups. As you can see, Jews are the lowest percentage Republican. This is an interesting study that I found just last week, I think. This was done by Pew, who many would say is the best research house in the country. The percentage approving Trump went from 38% to 29%. Okay, went down considerably. Now, what they did for this, and this is shown right in here, is for the second survey after January 6th, they went back and re-interviewed the same people who they interviewed before. So that difference is real. And that's a very good method for seeing what's happening over time to people's attitudes, is to interview the same people at 2 points in time. Question wording can make a difference. And we've already made that point with Jews, but I want to make it as well for another question, which is asked on general polls. In politics as of today, do you consider yourself a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent? So Gallup has 25% Republican in the country. Pew has 39% Republican in the country. Why? Gallup asks, are you Democrat, Republican, or independent, and stops there. Pew asks the independents, do you lean Democrat or do you lean Republican? And when we do that, we get 48% Dem, 39% Republican, and 7% independent. So you'll see both sets of figures out there. And you have to know if people have asked a Gallup type question or a Pew type question in looking at political party. Here on this slide, we have the percentage voting Democratic for Jewish voters, always higher than the percentage voting Democratic for all voters. An interesting thing here, was Donald Trump responsible for the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh? 72% of Jews said yes. Compared with white Christians and black Protestants, right, Jews are more negative toward Trump. No surprise there. Saying he's self-centered, 89%, for example. Okay, next. What happened between 2018 and 2020? Okay, the percentage on the congressional vote, the percentage of Jews voting Republican went up by 4%. Not a big change. Okay, so some other thoughts here. What issues generally unite or generally divide Jews? Well, uniting Jews, I think, is support for Israel. Although supporting some policies of Israel, like settlements, is divisive. But overall, most Jews are going to want to know how each candidate feels about Israel. Although we have a lot of data that shows that probably, unless some candidate got elected who doesn't think Israel should exist, that Israel's not the major thing upon which Jews vote. Iran is a divisive issue. 60% of Jews, though, in the only survey done by a neutral organization that used random digit dialing, and identified Jews properly, and it was done by SSRS again, showed that 60% of Jews supported the Iran deal. Something that unites Jews, though, with the partial exception of the Orthodox. The Pew 2013 survey shows that Jews are pretty well united around the social issues: abortion, gay rights, immigration, church-state issues, support for gun safety, health coverage for all, and voting rights. Those things unite Jews pretty much. Messaging to the Jewish community: support for Israel, right? Jews want to know how the candidates feel. I would place cautionary on Iran. There are lots of Jews out there who don't think the Iran deal was a very good deal. And I think that in messaging, we need to say that we need to take a cautious approach, but we need to try to get back into it, those types of things. Immigration reform. I think Jews are highly in favor of immigration reform. Now, due to the fact that Jews have a higher median age than all American adults, I think support for elderly programs would play well as part of the message. Support for science, support for climate change research, also important. Okay. Maimonides was asked, by the way, he was a doctor, remember? You're a scientist, but you also believe that the Torah was written by God. What do you do when the Torah and science seem to disagree? And Maimonides said, then I assume that I'm misinterpreting the Torah. And so Jews do, on the whole, believe in science, believe in climate change. That's an important issue, particularly to younger Jews. How do Jews help everyone? Things like the American Jewish World Service, for example, quite popular among younger Jews, and environmental issues. Being a geographer at the University of Miami, quite a number of courses that I teach have sections on climate change and environment. And in fact, those are important issues to younger people and younger Jews. Next, the role of the Jewish vote at the national level. 40% of Jews live in New York and California. I think I made this point the last time, but I think it's important to repeat it, okay? So consequently, they have little impact on presidential elections. They may have impact in Brooklyn, they may have impact in Los Angeles on local elections, but in terms of presidential elections, New York and California, for the foreseeable future, to go for the Democrats, pretty much no matter how Jews vote. In certain battleground states, we can say the Jewish vote is potentially important. But we had a long discussion on the Association for the Scientific Study of Jewry listserv, about 150 social scientists who study American Jews. And it is hard to say that the Jewish vote really makes the difference. You could claim, for example, as Black women in Georgia did, that their vote made the difference. So the Jewish vote is important. And you could point out in a state that you won by 12,000 votes, there are 100,000 Jews, the Jewish vote could have made the difference, yes, but so could have a lot of other groups. Finally, last slide. I got to go back here a little bit. If we devise policies that can be implemented quickly, that will change lives, get them through the Senate, let people see before the 2022 elections for the House of Representatives and the Senate that the Democrats did good things while they were in office. So we have to aim for things that can be done quickly and that can make a change. Next, I'm fine with Black Lives Matter. I think probably just about everyone on this call thinks that the goal of equal justice for everybody, the goal of equal justice for all is something we should strive to do. But the first time I heard Black Lives Matter as the name of a group, I got very nervous because, of course, the discussion became everyone matters, and it detracted from the discussion. The same thing during the demonstrations this summer. The first time I saw a sign that said defund the police, I said, that's going to cost the Democratic Party votes. Okay? It should be provide more money to improve our police force and make rules to make certain behaviors of the police. Okay? That's what needed the message it needed to get across. It's the same thing, by the way, with kneeling for the national anthem. People lost track of why they were kneeling because the whole discussion went around, desecrating the flag and desecrating the anthem itself. So I think that we have to do things quickly that are going to make a difference. And we really have to watch before the 2022 elections, the language that we use in doing the messaging around the issues we're talking about. Thank you all. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Ira. That was so interesting. And Jeff, so I have some questions for both of you. In the Hillary election and in this election, people are like, polls were off or polling isn't good. What kind of polling is needed to be both accurate and predictive? And I guess also as part of that same question, massive amounts of people voted by mail as opposed to in person. And how did that type of voting impact the polling? Why don't we start with Jeff and then we'll go to Ira.
The mail-in ballots had little to do with the polling. Like, we obviously asked people how they voted and we knew how people voted. It's one of the reasons why I was on a Zoom with all of you and talked about the red wave, that we knew exactly what was going to happen. And it is remarkable to me, like when we talk about it, again, I was on this Zoom with DJOP talking about the red wave that was going to happen. And yet on election night, and we told all the media and we told everyone, and yet on election night, amazingly, the media fell into the exact trap at an instant and started talking about who's up and who's down and didn't talk about the red wave the way we knew that they needed to. And so so the mail-in ballots, we knew how they were coming in. We knew how good they were for the Democrats. That's not the problem. The problem is some portion of the voters who either didn't talk to us, which Dr. Sheskin and I both talked about, and turnout, which of course we can't predict. That is impossible for us to predict. And then this late movement towards the Republicans that happened in part because, frankly, people perceived the Democrats were going to win everything. And that wasn't good because people started to recoil. The reason why Susan Collins is a senator in Maine is in part because of that. Voters walked in and said, I'm going to vote for Joe Biden because Donald Trump's an asshole. I'm not going to vote for that guy. But I'm not going to give the Democrats the whole store. And Susan Collins benefited from, frankly, Ruth Bader Ginsburg dying. Susan Collins benefited from being able to say, no, I'm not going to vote for whatever the hell her name is, Amy Coney Barrett, because that's wrong. And we know that was political and crap, but she benefited from that. So, there's the notion of like polling as accurate and predictive. Polls are never predictive. They're not supposed to be predictive. Polls are snapshots in time, and we should always remember that. It is bad that we think about polls as predictive because they have never been predictive, and they never will be. And if we sort of took, the New York Times had a great thing in the weeks leading up to the election saying, if the polls were off by a couple of points the way they were in 2016, this is what's going to happen. That's exactly what happened. Our polling for private clients, like when I'm working for Josh Shapiro, is not to predict what the election is going to be. It's to tell him what the message is supposed to be. It's to tell him what we should be talking about and how we should be communicating. That's what we care about. The New York Times and the media outlets are the ones trying to get clicks on sort of predicting the election, but that's not my job.
Ira, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll add a couple of things. One is survey research is great, but you can't expect it to do what it isn't and can never be designed to do. Take a look at those margins of error. Even if the margin of error on a survey is only 3%, if the election is close, when you come up in the poll with 52-48, the chances are pretty good that the person with the 48 could really be at 51. Okay, it's just too close. Surveys are meant to tell us if something is 50%, 40%, 30%, not whether it's 51% or 52%, particularly with all the problems of people picking up their phones today, et cetera. It's really hard to get the surveys to be that accurate. The other thing is, and I think, Jeffrey, you were saying this as well, I think the polls impact whether people go to the polls or not to vote. If you're told that your candidate is leading the polls by 7 percentage points, oh, they don't need my vote, I'll sit at home. And so I think the polls themselves have an influence on who shows up to vote.
It has. I just don't think it happened this year because the Democratic vote came in by and large so early, and most of us didn't vote on election day. That, like, I don't believe that. I think it does impact it from time to time, but not this time, to be true.
Okay.
And Jeff, you were talking about messaging. We're the Battleground Coalition, and we really care about these sort of purple states or states that can flip from red to blue. Yep. What did you learn this election cycle about these battleground states? And really, what should the messaging be in 22? For someone like Josh Shapiro, we have a Senate race to replace Toomey, thank God. And in all these other battleground states, you know, what did you learn, and what can you tell us as on-the-ground activists we should be messaging or doing?
Shapiro, not Shapiro. We'll start with that.
Sorry about that.
I can't tell you what the messaging is for 22. It's too early. I truly have no idea. And part of that depends on how the vaccine goes and how Biden does, and like that's a long way from now. What we should be worried about is we control every branch of government, and every time that's happened in recent history, we have gotten our asses kicked. And so we should be prepared for a bad year in 2022. So we have to defend against that in every way. And the Pennsylvania Senate race is one of those places that we absolutely have to focus. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. We got great news out of Ohio, where Jim Jordan, the awful Republican, is going to win that Republican primary. And therefore, we might even be able to steal a seat in Ohio that we shouldn't be able to win. So there's going to be opportunities across the country in 22, but the headwinds may be against us. As to 20, what did we learn? Like, if you think about the battlegrounds, what did we learn in Georgia? What did we learn in Pennsylvania? What did we learn in Wisconsin? We talked about healthcare and we won. Will that be the message in 22? I don't know. I really don't know. What we also found out is that in deep red states like Montana and Iowa, in a presidential election, we're going to get our butts kicked. And that even the best candidates and best messaging can't overcome the sort of deep intrinsic red nature of those states.
Is there a particular state that is ripe to go from red to blue, other than the ones that, you know, like Georgia obviously flipped?
Yeah.
Do you think
for 24?
Do you think it'll stay a purple state? Yeah, or even where we can pick up some Senate seats.
Yeah.
And going to what you said before, and this is for Ira too. You know, Obama said we took a shellacking in 10 and 18. You know, Democrats took the House away from Trump. Is there any way for us to hold at least the House or the Senate?
I actually think the odds are that we hold the Senate. Like, if you look at the seats that we are defending, the only seats that we could reasonably lose in 22 are Georgia, of course, with Warnock, Catherine Cortez Masto in Nevada, and Jeanne Shaheen in New Hampshire. I'm going to spend a lot of time worrying about those last two, but I believe that the odds are that we win those two. And then when you think about the seats we have to pick up, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, I mean, those start at the top of the heap. I actually should also add Arizona at the top with Mark Kelly, but I feel even better about that because the best candidate on the Republican side, Doug Ducey, decided not to run. So they'll have a crazy Republican who wins on that side. So I think that because the mere fact that we were able to win Georgia gives Chuck Schumer 4 years of running room, not a guarantee, but a lot better chance of keeping it. And the Georgia shift is something that we saw. We saw it before. Stacey Abrams deserves a lot of credit. We capitalized on it. There were a lot of people who didn't believe in Georgia in the runoffs. I said it. I said, like, who knows? Like, I think we shouldn't write off Georgia just because we've done poorly in the past in runoffs. The energy was there, and you know, thank God Chuck Schumer's the majority leader.
You want to add anything to that, Ira?
You know what occurred to me while Jeff was talking? I read something the other day that explains why it's so hard to get for the Democrats to get the Senate. There are 19 states out there who send 38 Republicans to the Senate. If you took the populations of those 19 states and added them together, they're less than the population of California that sends 2 Democrats. And that's really where the problem is. Okay, the problem is the Senate is highly not Democratic, and so is the Electoral College. And, you know, Democrats have won, what is it, I think 5 out of 6 of the popular vote in the last 6 elections. Yet Republicans won twice when they did not win the popular vote. And so the Electoral College and the way in which the Senate works with equal representation for a place like North Dakota and California, right? Both get 2 senators. That's really where our problem is. We can change our message all we want. The folks in North Dakota are unlikely to change their mind very much, although I think we've had some success in North Dakota as well. But that's what makes this so hard, is that the way the system is set up, both for the president as well as for the Senate, makes it very hard for Democrats to win.
We're running short on time, and I have 2 questions. One is the events of January 6th. Do you think, either of you, that the GOP will split into 2, or will one side of the party take over the other? In other words, will the GOP become the party of Trump, or will it become more like the Lincoln Project? And Ira, to that, if it becomes Trumpist, will Jews turn away from it? We'll start with Jeff and go to Ira.
Okay.
The Lincoln Project is a fake. It is a lovely group of smart and sane individuals who see dollar signs and who see the problems of Trump. That is not the Republican Party. The Republican Party is the party of Trump. We saw it in Pennsylvania yesterday. We saw it in Oregon yesterday. And so the Republicans have to deal with this themselves. There is no sort of moderation. There is no room for moderation. So they're going to splinter. Let's also be clear, our party is rife with the same problems. And if anybody thinks that that's not the case, you are fooling yourself. The battles that are happening with AOC and the squad are just as bad for us and just as problematic. So we have our own problems in our own house. We should, I'm sure there's a Talmudic quote about this, but let's take care of our own crap. And they're going to have to deal with theirs, but they are the party of Trump.
And Ira, do you think Jews will continue to, those Jews that are Republican will continue to support the party of Trump?
Well, I think the events of January 6th lost Trump a lot of support in lots of different places. Okay. And he probably lost support among Jews. But the fact that even 27% of Jews could vote for this guy, he's a racist. He's an anti-Semite. Yeah, I know he's got Jewish kids and Jewish grandchildren. I still make those statements. Okay. He is responsible in part for setting the atmosphere that created what happened in Pittsburgh. And as a result of that, I don't understand how you vote for him. Now, some of the Orthodox, for example, vote for him because he's probably going to set up policies, if Trump got elected again, that would put more money into private Jewish day schools. And they're all sending their kids to private Jewish day schools. There are some who are letting their pro-Israel trump every other opinion that they hold, because Trump, they think, is better for Israel. I would argue, and have argued, that in fact he's not. And Biden is certainly a friend for Israel. So, I think Trump may lose some support among Jews the next time around because of January 6th. But I'm shocked to listen to Republicans in the Senate make all kinds of excuses so that they don't have to vote for impeachment. But I think the Jewish vote for Trump will probably go down, but not by very much. Jeff, do you agree?
I think that people have short memories, and I'm not sure the Jews get any special dispensation from our various popes. I think that the reality is, sure, he lost some support for a period of time, but he's not going to get impeached. I think the impeachment stuff is a waste of time, frankly. And I think people will forget. So let's see. I think Joe Biden has to deliver on the vaccine and the economy. That's his job. If he
And
can do
Right.
that, we're in better shape.
And the final question I have for both of you, elections always teach us lessons. What do you think was the lesson of this election cycle? First you, Jeff, then you, Ira.
So for me, it's very simple. And I don't remember whether I talked about it on the Zoom that I did for you guys. Joe Biden did not make an economic argument about why he should be president of the United States. He got lucky. The pandemic is the reason Joe Biden is president. If we were talking about the economy, given how the voters were feeling, and certainly if we didn't have the pandemic, Donald Trump would be president of the United States today for sure, like undoubtedly. And so if we do not make an economic argument that makes sense to voters, we will lose continuously. Second, that even though my friend Joe Manchin will never vote for the filibuster, that if we don't change the system, and Ira Sheskin, Dr. Sheskin just talked about this, the Senate is almost impossible for us to win, in the same way that the Electoral College is almost impossible for us to win. And so the reality is, if we don't do a DC statehood or something like that that changes the map, we will not be able to control the Senate for any significant period of time, because the small states are just going to kill us. And the third thing is, we have to figure out how to do better with rural and non-college white voters. We're not going to win them, but we cannot get destroyed by them. And that does require a conversation about things like defund the police, that make many on the left and progressive side uncomfortable, but it is absolutely something we have to talk about, because the House is a small majority in part because of stuff like that.
Ira, what are your lessons?
I think we need a more centrist argument, and we need to watch our slogans. Short slogans work well, but they can't be things like defund the police, and they can't be things like Black Lives Matter. We need slogans that, yes, reflect the values of the Jewish community, but that will be bought into by centrists, okay? Because that's where the elections are going to be won.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. We could probably talk for hours, at least I could. The Jewish Battleground Coalition thanks you for being here. I just want to let you know about a DJOP event, a conversation with congresspersons. We're having Connor Lamb and Susan Wild. They're going to talk about their experiences on January 6th and the Biden agenda. Please go sign up for it. Go to DJOP. .org to our website and click on events tab, and you can sign up for it. If you want to rewatch the video from tonight, DGOP has a YouTube channel. Please go onto that YouTube channel, and I will also send out the video from tonight to all who were here and signed up, so you can get it that way as well. So thank you to our guests, Ira and Jeffrey. You were fabulous as usual. This was a really interesting and informative event. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the Jewish Battleground Coalition co-hosts, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.